The first thing you notice is the sound the fields make when they're dying. Cotton turns whisper into rasp, and the rasp rides the wind along the red clay roads of Sumter County, Alabama, where the Walsh plantation sits like a house that remembers better stories than the ones still being told. In 1847, the ledgers on Trent Walsh's desk began to sound like those fields, pages that once hummed with profit, now rough with overdue marks, notes scrawled in a hand, a little more frantic each week. He was 42, hair gone prematurely grey at the temples, a man who had learned to wear his shoulders high and his debts low. But debt, like heat, climbs. Creditors came with polite hats and impolite numbers, and the bank's letters grew tight at the margins, a visible choking. Corn prices had undercut his feed plans. Rain had come without timing. Cotton had yellowed in a week that was supposed to make it silver. Walsh took to staring past the front gallery toward the north field as if the horizon might give him a new line of credit. It never did. Instead, it gave him a son coughing behind a closed door. Norman Walsh, 23, had returned from studies in Mobile with a scholar's diction and lungs that betrayed him. Consumption, said Dr. Tuttle, who smelled of camphor and had the bedside manner of a ledger. Honest, cold, final. Norman's cough stitched the nights into uneven pieces. Some dawns he woke with a clear eye and a joke. More often he woke with a wheeze and a crimsoned cloth. Trent kept his affection put away like inheritance silver, but he watched Norman with a calculation that had love folded inside it, the way a map hides a noose. A family like the Walshes was supposed to move forward by bloodline. A line is hard to draw when your only heir is out of breath. The plan did not arrive with thunder. It came one night with the soft tick of the study clock and the raw arithmetic of a man who refuses to be erased. He needed continuity more than he needed honesty. If nature would not grant it, perhaps paper would. A marriage could be made where a marriage could not lawfully stand. A promise could be offered where a promise would never be honored. Somewhere in the county there would be a man willing to play a priest for a price, a pair of witnesses who would sign for a bottle and the favor owed. And there was, inside his own household, the particular solution. A young woman named Nancy. Nancy had been born into bondage and taught by no one, and yet she had taught herself to read. Watching from the shadow of the parlor door as a boy, Norman recited declensions for his tutor. She matched shapes to sounds, built a small cathedral of letters in her memory, lit it with candle stubs of time stolen at the edge of night. By 20, she moved through the main house with quiet competence, in the pantry's cool where spices lived, in the hallway's hush, in Norman's room where she smoothed the bedclothes and set down the glass of laudanum with a care that felt like prayer. She had a mind that made lists: what must be done, what might be possible, what can be survived. Trent noticed the reading first in the way she handled a note, how her eyes flicked to a line longer than a servant's courtesy would require. He noticed, too, what men like him always notice and pretend not to: her beauty, symmetrical as measured land, steady as sunrise. But he said nothing until the clock in his study convinced him that desperation was a kind of permission. Then, in May of 1847, he sent word for Nancy to come to the office books stacked in teetering columns, an inkpot scabbed black, a map of the property pinned like a wound on the wall. He spoke with his voice set to benevolent, a tone white men could put on like a clean shirt. He said he had watched her diligence, her decency, and believed Providence had arranged a kindness. He said Norman needed companionship, tenderness, a quiet household hope. He said that freedom, the holy word he'd kept back like a trump, could be hers if she would make a family of the Walsh name. The arrangement would be simple: a lawful marriage to Norman, witnessed and blessed, a child to carry the line, papers to manumit her upon the child's birth. He did not have to say the other part out loud, that she would have to agree now, before the ink set, and carry the risk like women in her condition always carried the risk alone. Nancy listened as if standing on the narrow bridge between a burning field and a river she did not know how to swim. Freedom had lived in her like a rumor with teeth, something that bit the inside of her mouth when she tried to say it. She asked to see the papers. Trent produced them as if unveiling a miracle, seals pressed with a metal stamp, signatures that arched with confidence, language familiar from the Bible's cadences, solemn, irrevocable, binding. The ink shone wet. The future did, too. She asked a question carefully: could she keep a copy? Of course, he said, smiling a second too long. She asked whether Norman knew. He will, he said, and for an instant his eyes went flat. She fought the tremor in her fingers and nodded. Somewhere inside her, two Nancys argued, the one who had learned never to trust what she could not hold, and the one who understood that a forged door is sometimes the only exit from a burning house. She took the pen, she made her name, the letters she had practiced 1,000 nights, each line a jailbreak. When she lifted her hand, she felt the room tilt toward a future that might love her back. Norman learned 2 days later. Shock first, then protest the rhetoric of a gentleman who could not see the chains in a promise. Trent talked the way men talk when they put a leash on prayer and call it providence. He invoked the family line. He invoked dying wishes and the language of sacrifice. Norman's body, tired as a clock at day's end, yielded. He told himself mercy had many forms. He told himself Nancy deserved safety, and safety wore paper like armor. The ceremony happened the next week, at a strange hour when the sky looked undecided and the crickets tuned up like a jury. The man who arrived called himself Father Murphy, with a collar that read well at a distance and hands that shook when he set down his book. 2 witnesses from the plantation, men who had learned to keep secrets for wages, stood by the mantel. "Do you?" the not-quite priest intoned, and the words moved through the room like a performance done on the cheap, convincing enough for an audience that needs to believe. Nancy spoke her vows in a clear voice that sounded borrowed from a better life. Norman looked at her with a surprised softness that came from the place in him pain hadn't yet carved hollow. Signatures followed, the seal thumped. The witnesses nodded with their mouths and not their eyes. A copy was placed in Nancy's careful hands. "Proof," said the room. "Paper," whispered something colder. Afterward, the house rearranged itself around the new fiction. Nancy moved to a small room near Norman's, a space that smelled of lye soap and fresh linen, and a hope she did not trust yet. Her duties changed shape. Less kitchen heat, more chamber light, more time at the bedside with books to read in a voice that smoothed the corners of the afternoon. She learned the rhythm of his medicines, the hour his cough took him, the angle to open the shutter that let in warmth without dust. He learned the cadence of her silences and where laughter hid when she was trying to be polite. They talked of ships he'd read about and recipes she loved and the faint, forbidden subject of places not here. In August, when the heat made the fields gasp and even the river sounded tired, Nancy felt the small, insistent flutter that calls itself the future from the inside. She told Norman first. His face altered, the way morning alters a room, joy and fear stitched together. Trent received the news like a verdict that favored him. He walked the gallery with a step that sounded, for the first time in a long time, like a man certain the ground would hold. He ordered extra rations for Nancy. He secured regular calls for Dr. Tuttle. He smiled at the talk of the child and never used the word freedom again. Through it all, Nancy traced the letters on her copy of the papers at night, the way a believer touches a relic worn smooth by other hands. She memorized the curves of the seal, the slope of the signatures, the way the ink bled just slightly where the nib had paused. She told herself paper was stronger than men if you learned to read it hard enough. She told herself a promise had weight if she held it every night until her fingers remembered. When fear came, the kind that arrives without footsteps and sits on the bed until breathing is expensive, she named streets on a map she'd never seen, towns she'd only read upon labels and bills of lading, northward words that tasted like cool water. She said, after the birth, the way some people say, Amen. Trent watched the house grow quieter and the columns of his ledger grow marginally less red, found reasons to believe Providence still liked him. But at dusk, when the lamps were being trimmed and shadows made every gesture look like its own echo, he sometimes stood in the doorway of the study and stared at that copy of the estate map, as if waiting for it to confess. He had the plan, he had the papers, he had the witnesses and the silence and the county's indifference. He had, he believed, beaten the law by learning its shape and wearing it like borrowed clothes. The fields kept rasping anyway, and in the little room by Norman's, Nancy lay awake with a hand on the small life inside her, listening to the night's creaks and the hallway's hush, and trying to decide which sound was hope and which was warning. The wedding had been over for only a week, yet the plantation already spoke of Nancy in a different tone. The slaves whispered, Miss Nancy, behind her back, half mockery, half superstition. Some thought she had cast a spell, others thought she was marked by God. In truth, she felt neither blessed nor cursed, only watched. Every corridor of the Walsh house now had eyes. Her new room was small but private, something unheard of for a woman who had been property all her life. The mattress was thin, the window small, but it had a lock on the door, and that, to Nancy, felt like the beginning of ownership. A trunk in the corner held her copy of the marriage papers wrapped in linen. At night, she touched the folded sheet like a prayer, as if ink could protect her from a world written against her. Norman was kind at first. The sickness had softened him, made him speak as though every sentence cost something valuable. He asked her to read to him psalms, medical pamphlets, old newspapers. Her voice soothed him more than the morphine tincture Dr. Tuttle left on the table. Between coughs, he asked questions about her childhood, her favorite songs, the stars above the fields. Nancy answered cautiously, as if truth itself might be a trap. Yet she found herself laughing sometimes, and each laugh felt like walking a little farther from the line that divided master and property. Outside their rooms, Trent's presence thickened the air. He moved with new confidence, as if the plantation itself had inhaled and held its breath for him. He spoke of repairs, of a new harvest, of debts that might soon be settled. When neighbors visited, he dropped careful hints about an heir on the way. "Providence smiles again," he'd say, and his guests would nod, pretending not to notice that the child's mother was the girl who used to serve their tea. The false priest, Father Murphy, disappeared after the ceremony. No one in town remembered hiring him, and no church claimed him. A few of the house servants said they'd seen him leaving with a small bag of silver coins, muttering prayers that didn't sound Catholic or Baptist. Nancy tried not to think of him. The memory of his eyes, uneasy, darting, made her stomach tighten. As summer deepened, Norman's health wavered like a candle. Some days he sat on the porch with her, reading aloud between breaths. Other days he slept for hours, his skin damp and grey. Nancy stayed near him, cooling his forehead, whispering small things to fill the silences, stories of freedom she had heard from travelers, recipes her mother once knew, dreams she had never spoken aloud. Norman listened with a tenderness that frightened her more than cruelty ever had. He began to speak of the future as if it were a gift he could give. "When I'm stronger, we'll go north. I'll see to it myself." Each time he said it, she smiled and pretended to believe. Inside, she imagined a line on the map, tracing from Alabama through Tennessee, through states whose names tasted like possibility. She would raise her child free. That was the shape of her prayer. By late August 1847, the first signs of pregnancy showed. The plantation doctor confirmed it, while Trent stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes gleaming with the cold light of victory. Norman cried quietly after the doctor left. "This means something good," he whispered, though his voice trembled with fear. "Father will have to free you now." Trent had other thoughts. That night he opened his ledger and began to plan like a merchant preparing a shipment. An heir meant security, reputation, leverage with his creditors. He ordered better food for Nancy, told the overseer to spare her from field work, and even had the parlor chairs reupholstered in brighter fabric. To anyone looking in from the outside, the Walsh plantation seemed to revive. But inside the main house, a quiet tension replaced peace, the sense that everything now depended on the child in Nancy's womb. Norman's health faltered again as autumn approached. His coughs turned wet, and his fever came and went like the tide. Nancy sat beside him, spooning broth between his cracked lips, her own body heavy and unsteady. She read scripture to distract them both, but sometimes the words turned to ghosts of promises that mocked her. "Let not your heart be troubled," she read one night, and Norman smiled sadly. "That verse was not written for people like us," he said, and the way he said "us" made her throat tighten. Trent avoided the sick room. When he did appear, he brought ledgers or physicians, never comfort. He treated his son as a fragile investment, not a dying man. Nancy saw it clearly, the calculation in his eyes, the way he watched her belly rather than her face. She began to fear that when Norman's breath gave out, the promise of her freedom would die with him. In November, the rains came, thick and relentless. The house grew damp. Mold crept along the baseboards. The fields were ruined, but Trent hardly noticed. He spent his evenings in the study, letters from creditors spread like fallen leaves across his desk. He told himself the baby would save the name, would give the lenders reason to wait. He drank more, slept less, and sometimes stood at the foot of the staircase listening to Nancy sing softly in Norman's room. The melody stirred something he could neither name nor admit. One morning, Norman asked Nancy to open the curtains wide. Sunlight flooded the bed, turning the dust in the air to gold. "Promise me something," he whispered. "If I'm not here when the baby comes, promise you'll still believe you're free." She tried to laugh, but the sound came out broken. "We have the papers," she said, clutching his hand. "No one can take that." He smiled faintly. "Papers are only honest when men are." That evening his fever returned. Dr. Tuttle came and went, muttering that the lungs were collapsing. Trent stood at the window with a glass of brandy, expression unreadable. Nancy prayed through the night, wiping Norman's forehead, listening to his breath shorten. Near dawn, the prayers became meaningless noises. By morning, Norman was still. When she screamed, the house seemed to pause, as though even the walls understood. Trent entered quietly, looked at his son for a long moment, then at Nancy. He placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, a gesture meant to look paternal but felt like possession. "God has taken what was his," he said, "but he leaves us purpose, the child." Nancy collapsed beside the bed, sobbing into the sheets. She didn't see Trent's face harden or the faint smile that came and went like lightning. He already knew what the next months would bring. A funeral that would cost more than he could afford, and afterward, a woman too valuable to let go. The funeral was modest by Southern standards. A preacher read the Psalms. Neighbors offered condolences that sounded more like gossip. Nancy watched from a distance, veil covering her face, the baby moving inside her like a heartbeat that refused to stop. When the coffin was lowered, she whispered a promise to the earth. "I'll raise our child free, Norman. I'll keep faith with the paper and with you." After the mourners left, Trent approached her, his expression unreadable. "You'll stay in the main house," he said softly. "It's what Norman would have wanted." She bowed her head, unable to argue. For the next weeks, the plantations sank into a muffled quiet. Nancy waited for Trent to speak of the manumission papers, to arrange the lawyer, to fulfill the vow that had been the only reason she'd agreed to this nightmare. But when she asked, his answers came like smoke, soft, shapeless, and gone before she could grasp them. "In time," he'd say, "after the birth, there's still much to settle." Each postponed promise tightened the cage around her heart. She began to see what she hadn't dared name, that the papers she held might be nothing more than the inked mask of a lie. Yet she could not let go of hope. Hope was the only thing she could still call hers. By the first week of February, 1848, her pregnancy was heavy, and she dreamed nightly of running through woods, through rain, through any place that didn't have the Walsh name carved into it. She would wake to find Trent standing in the doorway, the look on his face unreadable, the air in the room suddenly colder. "Just checking," he'd say. "You and the baby must be safe." She would nod, wait for him to leave, and then press the papers to her chest until the trembling stopped. Each night, she told herself the same fragile truth, that freedom could not be forged if faith was real. But she was beginning to suspect that faith, like paper, burns too easily in the hands of desperate men. The winter of 1848 inches, Sumter County was unusually harsh. A thin layer of frost coated the cotton fields that once shimmered white with life, and the air in the plantation house smelled faintly of smoke and sorrow. Norman's absence had turned the rooms hollow. The piano in the parlor gathered dust, and even the servants spoke in whispers, as if the dead man might still be listening. Nancy felt the weight of that silence most of all. She moved through the halls with the heavy gait of late pregnancy, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Each step reminded her that the child inside was now her only claim to freedom, if Trent kept his word. She waited for him to bring up the manumission papers, to tell her when the lawyer would come, when she could begin her new life. But every time she asked, Trent's answers slipped away like mist. "You mustn't worry yourself, Nancy," he'd say with a smile too polished to be sincere. "The child must come first. Once we have a healthy birth, everything will fall into place." Everything. That word began to sound dangerous. At night, she would lie awake in her small room, replaying every promise, every phrase from that night in his office when he first proposed the deal. She had believed him because he spoke with the confidence of a man who owned everything he saw. Now she wondered if that confidence had been the trap. Dr. Tuttle visited twice a week. He examined her without looking at her face, muttered something about her fine condition, and then went straight to Trent's study to discuss arrangements. She never heard the words, but she saw the exchange of envelopes, the curt nods, the way Trent's eyes hardened when he caught her watching. One morning, Nancy woke to the sound of hammering. Two field hands were repairing the shutters outside her room, nailing them tighter. She asked the overseer about it. He shrugged. "Mr. Walsh don't like drafts," he said. But she knew. The windows had never been loose before. By late February, her contractions began. She labored for hours, the cries swallowed by the heavy walls of the big house. The only people allowed in the room were Inez, the cook, her only friend, and a local midwife who said nothing unless spoken to. Trent stood in the corner, his face half hidden by shadow, his hands clasped behind his back like a judge waiting for a verdict. When the child's first cry finally pierced the night, it sounded almost defiant. A girl, healthy, pink, alive. Trent's expression faltered. For a heartbeat, disappointment crossed his face before he forced a smile. "A fine start," he said, "but next time, perhaps Providence will give us a boy." Nancy barely heard him. She clutched her daughter to her chest, tears spilling down her face. She whispered the same word again and again, "Free." In the following days, the house filled with a strange, uneasy calm. Nancy recovered slowly, her body weak, but her mind alert. She waited for Trent to mention the papers, to summon the lawyer, to make good on his word, but he didn't. Instead, he began visiting her room in the evenings under the pretense of checking on the baby. At first, he came with gifts, fruit, a blanket, a silver rattle. Then, his tone changed. He spoke of legacy, of duty, of how the family depended on her now. One night, he sat in the chair beside her bed longer than usual. The lamp threw his shadow across the wall, long and sharp. "You understand, Nancy," he said softly, "that your child belongs to this house. She's a Walsh by blood. You and I must ensure her future together." The way he said together made her stomach twist. "I only ask that you keep your promise, sir," she said, her voice trembling. "I've done what you asked. I've given you the heir." He smiled, a slow, reptilian smile that chilled her blood. "And I will keep my word, in time. But you see, circumstances have changed. A child needs stability. The papers can wait." She felt something collapse inside her. "But you said—" "I said many things," he interrupted, "and you do well to remember who owns this house and everything in it." After that night, Trent's visits became more frequent and more intrusive. He no longer knocked. He spoke to her in a tone that made her skin crawl, calling her darling girl, brushing her shoulder as he looked into the crib. Inez noticed the change too. "Keep that door locked," she whispered one afternoon, slipping a small iron key into Nancy's hand. "He's not right in the head these days, but locks only matter when the master respects them." In March, Trent entered her room uninvited again. He reeked of whiskey. The baby was asleep in the cradle, and the lamp burned low. "You should be grateful, Nancy," he murmured. "You have what most women dream of: security, a home, a child of standing." Nancy stepped back, clutching the blanket around her. "Please leave," she said. Trent smiled faintly. "Don't forget who made you what you are." What followed was the beginning of a nightmare that no one in the house would speak of aloud. Trent's nightly visits became violations of every kind, silent, methodical, cruelly justified by the twisted logic of ownership. He left no visible bruises, only the kind that live under the skin and bloom in silence. Through it all, Nancy's will hardened into something almost unbreakable. She endured, not because she was powerless, but because she was planning. She studied every corner of the room, every creak in the hallway, every time the night guards changed shift. She began writing again, small notes hidden inside the lining of her pillow, recording dates, words, and threats. Evidence, she thought. Someday someone will read this and know. When April arrived, her opportunity came. She overheard two field hands talking near the well about the sheriff riding through town that week. She remembered his name, Jackson, and the way Norman had once said he was an honorable man. That night, Nancy gathered her courage. She waited until dawn, swaddled her daughter in a shawl, and tucked the marriage papers inside her dress. Then, with the steady calm of someone who has nothing left to lose, she walked out the back door, barefoot, into the grey morning light. The dirt road to town stretched 12 miles. but she didn't feel the distance. Each step was fueled by rage, fear, and the fragile belief that the law must still mean something. When she reached the sheriff's office, her dress was torn and her feet were bleeding, but she stood tall. "I'm here to report a crime," she said. Sheriff Jackson looked up from his desk, squinting at her. "Whose property are you?" "I was promised freedom," she said, pulling the papers from her dress. "I was married to Norman Walsh. These are my documents." He took the papers, examined them, and frowned. "You think this is legal?" "It's signed and sealed," she insisted. "Your own law says." He cut her off with a cold laugh. "You misunderstand, girl. There's no such thing as a marriage between your kind and his. This," he held up the paper, "isn't worth the ink it's printed with." Nancy felt her knees weaken. "But he promised." "Promises don't change blood," he said. "You belong to Mr. Walsh, and you'd best thank your stars I don't charge you for forgery." She tried again to speak, but his tone sharpened. "You'll be returned immediately. The man's your rightful owner." When she protested, he struck the table with his hand. "Enough. I won't have trouble from a slave pretending to be a lady." The sheriff called 2 deputies, who bound her wrists and led her out as her daughter wailed in her arms. The ride back to the plantation was slow and cruel, the baby crying until her voice gave out. Every bump of the road hammered a truth into Nancy's bones. Freedom had never been real. The papers had always been the trick of a desperate man. When they reached the Walsh plantation, Trent was waiting in the doorway. His expression was calm, too calm. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said politely. "We'll handle her discipline." The sheriff nodded, tipped his hat, and left. Trent turned to Nancy, his eyes gleaming with quiet fury. "You've embarrassed me," he said softly. "You've risked everything. You think the law will protect you? The law is me." He ordered her to the old storage barn behind the stables, a low building with one small window and a heavy padlock on the door. "You'll stay here until I decide otherwise," he said. "You and the child." Nancy clutched her daughter close as the door slammed. The light vanished, replaced by the smell of dust and rotting wood. She heard the click of the lock, then footsteps fading away. For a long time, she sat in silence, rocking the child, whispering the same words over and over, until they became a vow carved in her soul. "I will find a way out. He may own the walls, but he will never own my story." For the first 3 days inside the barn, Nancy thought the silence itself might kill her before starvation could. There was a single crack of light that cut through the boards high above, catching the motes of dust that drifted like tiny ghosts. The air smelled of hay, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of decay. Each morning, a tray of food appeared by the door: cornbread, a tin cup of water, a bit of salted pork. She could hear the lock turn afterward, the sound echoing like a bell that measured captivity instead of time. Her daughter whimpered often, hungry and restless. Nancy named her quietly, whispering it into the baby's ear, so that even the walls wouldn't know. Hope. She chose it not because she felt it, but because she refused to let Trent take the word from her. On the 4th day, she heard footsteps in the straw outside, light ones, careful ones. The key turned again, slower this time. The door creaked open just wide enough for a familiar face to appear. Inez, the cook. Her hands trembled as she set down a small bundle of food and a blanket. "Child," Inez whispered, eyes darting toward the house. "He's lost his mind. Sheriff Dunn told him you caused a spectacle in town. He says he's keeping you here till you learn your place." Nancy's voice was hoarse. "He said the same thing to his son. Then he buried him." Inez looked at her with deep pity, her eyes shining in the half-dark. "You hold on," she said. "Ain't every soul in this county blind? Some ears still listen." Before Nancy could reply, Inez pressed something small and folded into her palm a scrap of paper. "There's a woman in town, Martha. She works for the Cornell family. If ever you get a chance, you find her. Tell her Inez sent you." The name meant nothing yet, but the whisper of another possible world, someone who might care, someone outside, felt like oxygen. For the next week, the days fell into a pattern of monotony and quiet terror. Trent visited each evening. He came alone, carrying a lantern whose light made the barn walls flicker. His voice was calm, practiced, the voice of a man explaining rules to someone too stupid to understand. "You see, Nancy," he would begin, "you were meant to serve this house, not to question it, not to run from it. The sheriff may have brought you back, but I won't risk that kind of embarrassment again, so we'll do things differently now. He would step closer, his boots grinding in the dirt, his shadow sliding over her face. The visits were not violent in the way the world understands violence. They were worse deliberate, rehearsed, and built from the belief that power justifies everything. When he left, Nancy would sit in the corner of the barn, rocking Hope and staring at the sliver of moon that cut through the crack above. She counted the nights not by numbers, but by the rhythm of Hope's breathing. One evening, during one of Inez's secret visits, Nancy finally asked, "Why do you help me? You could lose everything." Inez gave a soft, bitter laugh. "Because I seen too much to keep quiet, and because I owe your mama. She worked this house before me. She died here, same as you would, if somebody don't change how the story ends." That night, after Inez left, Nancy sat in the dark and whispered her mother's name, long forgotten on the plantation. She told Hope about her grandmother, about the songs she used to hum while washing laundry by the creek. It was the first time since her confinement that she allowed herself to cry, not out of fear, but memory. 2 weeks passed. The air grew heavy with spring rain, and the barn roof leaked in slow, rhythmic drops. Hope developed a small cough. Nancy begged Trent for medicine, but he only stared at her as if her desperation amused him. "Don't act like a mother," he said flatly. "You're fortunate I let the child live." She felt something shift inside her then, not just anger, but a cold, deliberate resolve. Trent believed he had buried her spirit under humiliation. He was wrong. Every word he spoke was building something inside her, something stronger than fear. On the 17th night, as thunder rolled across the fields, the lock turned again, but this time it wasn't Trent or Inez. A figure stepped inside, cloaked in darkness. Nancy tensed, clutching Hope tight. "Quiet," whispered a voice she recognized, one of the older field hands. A man called Abel. He was Inez's cousin, his beard streaked with gray, his hands calloused from decades of picking cotton. He set down a lantern and a small pouch of coins. "Inez sent me," he murmured. "She say a message gone reach them Cornells soon. They hate Mr. Walsh worse than snakes. Might be they help." Nancy blinked through the dim light. "Why would they care?" Abel gave a weary grin. "White folks love revenge more than justice. If hurting him means helping you, they'll listen." He explained quickly. Inez had managed to send word to Martha, who served in the Cornell kitchen. The Cornells, wealthy landowners who had feuded with Trent Walsh for years, were known to keep their ears open for scandal. If they learned that Walsh had forged legal documents and kept a woman imprisoned with his child, it could ruin him socially and financially. It was a slim hope, but it was something. After Abel left, Nancy sat in silence, heart pounding. Hope stirred in her arms, the baby's breath warm against her skin. "You hear that, my love?" she whispered. "Somebody knows. Somebody might come." But rescue did not arrive quickly. Days turned to weeks, and the barn became both prison and nursery. Nancy's hair grew thin, her body frail, but her mind sharpened. She memorized every squeak of the door, every voice that passed outside. One morning, she saw something through the crack in the wood. 2 strangers arriving at the house. A man and a woman, well dressed, the kind of visitors who made Trent straighten his coat. From the distance, she couldn't hear their words, but she saw the tension in Trent's shoulders. The conversation lasted long. When they left, he slammed the door so hard that even the birds scattered. That night, he did not visit the barn. Instead, Inez appeared, breathless and trembling. "It's starting," she said. "Them Cornells came today, Mrs. Elizabeth Cornell herself. She's clever, too clever. She knows about you now." Nancy's heart leapt. "Will she help?" Inez hesitated. "She says she will, but she ain't doing it just for you, child. She's got her own reasons. You be careful." "What reasons?" Nancy asked. Inez shook her head. "Old grudges, long stories. Just know this, if she gets what she wants, you'll get what you need." When she left, Nancy held Hope and closed her eyes. The sound of thunder outside had turned to a steady rain, the kind that beats like fists on the roof. For the first time in months, she felt something stirring that almost resembled faith. Somewhere beyond those wet fields, another woman, a white woman with power, had heard her story, and that woman's hatred for Trent Walsh might just be the one weapon Nancy had left. As she drifted into a restless sleep, she whispered into the dark, "Let her hate him enough to save us." The storm that had rolled through Sumter County left the fields drenched, and the air heavy, like the land itself was waiting for something to break. For the first time in weeks, the barn door creaked open, not with Trent's shadow, but with sunlight. Nancy squinted into it, clutching hope closer as Inez stepped inside, carrying a basket and a look that mixed fear with a kind of secret fire. "It's happening, child," she whispered, setting the basket down. "Them Cornells, they know everything." Nancy's heart stuttered. "Everything?" Inez nodded. "Elizabeth Cornell. She's the one who came to the house last week. Said she wanted to talk business, but I saw her eyes cold and sharp like a hawk's. She already knew about you before she stepped through that door." "How?" Martha told her. The name made Nancy's breath catch. She remembered the note Inez had pressed into her hand, the name scrawled in pencil, nearly rubbed away. It had found its way out of the plantation, across town, through a market whisper, into another woman's kitchen, and now to the ears of someone with power. "Tell me what happened," Nancy urged. Inez crouched beside her, speaking low. "Miss Elizabeth and her husband, James, been waiting years to ruin your master. They got money and pride enough to do it too." She sat in that parlor, sipping tea like she wasn't holding a knife behind her smile. Said she'd heard troubling things about forged papers, false marriages. Asked questions that made Mr. Walsh turn red as a devil. He tried to laugh it off, but she kept talking, each word tighter than the last. Inez's voice dropped to a whisper. Then she said something that made him go quiet. "A man who plays God with other people's lives," she called him. Said such a man don't deserve to carry a family name. Nancy could almost see it. The proud, manipulative Trent cornered in his own parlor, trapped not by chains but by reputation. She imagined the fury simmering behind his composed smile, the way his fingers must have tightened around his glass. "What will she do?" Nancy asked. "She offered him a deal," Inez said. "Told him she'd keep his secret quiet if he'd sell you and the baby to her family. Said she needed a good housemaid." He tried to refuse at first, but she reminded him about them investors he'd been caught in. Said no man would trust a liar with forged papers. And he agreed. He did. The words hit Nancy like cold water. "He sold us." Inez gave a grim nod. "For less than half your worth too. Pride's a heavy debt to pay." For a long moment, Nancy couldn't breathe. Freedom wasn't coming, at least not the way she'd imagined, but this was something else. Movement, a change. Even captivity can shift when new hands hold the keys. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow," Inez said. "Cornell wagons come in the morning. You'll leave with them." Nancy's first instinct was disbelief. After all the months of deceit, after the cruelty and the lies, she couldn't let herself believe that salvation might wear the face of another master. But Inez saw the doubt and gripped her shoulder. "Listen to me, girl. This woman, she's not like him. She ain't kind, maybe, but she's clever. And she hates him more than she'll ever hate you. That might just save you both." Inez left before dawn, leaving Nancy awake with her thoughts. The baby slept against her chest, the faint rhythm of her heartbeat mingling with the rain still dripping through the rafters. Nancy stared at the faint light creeping through the cracks and whispered to herself, "If I must trade one cage for another, let it be the one with a door." Vice. The next morning came grey and trembling. The Cornell wagon arrived just as the mist was lifting off the fields. From her window in the big house, Elizabeth Cornell watched the transaction unfold with the calm of a woman attending a play she'd written herself. Trent Walsh stood on the veranda, his coat buttoned high, his pride hanging by a thread. "I trust this will end the matter," he said, handing over a folded document. Elizabeth accepted it with a polite smile. "For your sake, Mr. Walsh, let's hope so. Reputation, once tarnished, is a difficult thing to polish." Her husband James added, almost casually, "We'll make sure the girl and her child are treated with dignity." The pause before the last word carried more threat than comfort. Trent's jaw tightened. He wanted to protest, to claim ownership, to remind them that the child bore his blood, but he saw the warning in Elizabeth's eyes. The deal was done, and the Cornells now owned his most dangerous secret. Nancy was brought out from the barn, carrying Hope wrapped in a blanket. She was thinner than anyone remembered, her eyes ringed with exhaustion but burning with a strange, quiet strength. Trent didn't look at her as the overseer escorted her to the wagon. Elizabeth, however, did. Their eyes met, one woman of privilege, one woman of survival, and in that moment Nancy understood. This was not mercy, it was strategy. but strategy could still open a door. "Mrs. Cornell," Nancy said softly, bowing her head. Elizabeth studied her for a long moment. "You'll call me madam while under my roof, but you will not be mistreated. Do you understand?" "Yes, madam." Elizabeth's gaze softened barely. "Then we'll see what use truth can be put to." The wagon jolted forward. As the Walsh plantation receded behind her, Nancy looked back once, watching the great house grow smaller until it was just a pale smudge against the horizon. She felt no grief, only a cold satisfaction that the man who had chained her now lived under the same fear he'd once inflicted. Retham, the Cornell estate, was a different world. Larger, yes, but colder. The main house stood on a rise, overlooking acres of tobacco, its chimneys like sentinels. Nancy was given a small cabin near the kitchen gardens, clean, with a real bed and a window that actually opened. To a woman who had lived in a locked barn, it felt almost like paradise. Elizabeth visited her that evening, unaccompanied. "You must rest," she said briskly, "and regain your strength. I will have use for you soon." Nancy hesitated. "Usa." Elizabeth smiled faintly. "Oh, don't mistake me for a savior. I didn't buy you to ease my conscience. I bought you to destroy a man who's forgotten what power costs, and to do that, I need you alive, sane, and credible." Nancy's pulse quickened. "You mean?" "I mean we'll take Mr. Walsh apart, piece by piece," Elizabeth said, her voice low and measured. "And we'll use the law to do it. The same law that spat in your face will eat him alive if fed the right evidence." Nancy's breath caught. "They'll never believe me." "No," Elizabeth agreed, "but they might believe a man, which means we must find one, a witness, the one who married you, perhaps." "The priest?" Elizabeth's eyes gleamed. "Exactly. The ghost with a collar. Find him, and you'll have your justice." Nancy stared at her, torn between gratitude and unease. "Why are you helping me?" Elizabeth paused at the door. "Because once, long ago, Trent Walsh took something from me too, and I've been waiting 20 years to take it back." The door closed softly behind her, leaving Nancy in a room that no longer felt like a cell. She looked down at her sleeping daughter and whispered, "He'll never touch us again." Outside, thunder rolled once more in the distance, not the storm of the sky this time, but the gathering storm of reckoning. And for the first time in her life, Nancy did not flinch when she heard it. Elizabeth Cornell was not a woman who acted from impulse. Everything she did, every measured word, every glance was part of a pattern invisible to most. From the moment Nancy and Hope arrived on her estate, Elizabeth had begun weaving that pattern tighter, preparing to pull it like a net around Trent Walsh's neck. For Nancy, the first few days on the Cornell property felt like a fever dream: clean linens, steady meals, sunlight through unbarred windows. After months of darkness, she hardly trusted light. Hope slept soundly for the first time since birth, and Nancy spent hours just watching her daughter breathe, her tiny chest rising and falling like a promise. But even as her body healed, her mind stayed wary. She understood that she had not been rescued out of kindness. She had been acquired a witness, a weapon, a means to someone else's end. Still, Elizabeth's cruelty was of a different breed. It was not the random violence of Trent Walsh, but the cold precision of a chess player who believed she could correct the world by mastering its ugliness. Each morning, Elizabeth sent for Nancy to join her in the parlor under the pretext of instruction. What she really meant was interrogation. She would pour herself tea, take a seat near the window, and begin her quiet, merciless questions. "Tell me again," she said one morning, "how Mr. Walsh approached you. Every word, every gesture." Nancy repeated the story until her throat ached. The office, the papers, the seal, the trembling priest, the whispered promises. Elizabeth listened, unmoving, eyes sharp as glass. "And you kept a copy of those papers?" "Yes, madam," Nancy replied, "hidden in the hem of my old dress. I still have them." "Good," Elizabeth said. "Never destroy a lie. It's the best proof a liar ever leaves behind." For the first time, Nancy saw something almost human flicker across the woman's face, a flash of memory, maybe pain, but it vanished before she could name it. That afternoon, Elizabeth summoned her husband, James, a man with the smile of a banker and the heart of an accountant. Together they examined the papers Nancy had hidden. "Forgery," James concluded, tracing the embossed seal with a fingertip. The signatures mimic Judge Pritchard's, but the ink formula is wrong. The clerk's hand is false. He even used the wrong parish seal. Elizabeth nodded slowly. That means he either forged it himself or paid someone who could. And if we find that someone, James said, we find the rope to hang him with. They decided to begin quietly. Elizabeth would test the legal waters first to see what could be done. 2 days later, she arrived at the sheriff's office with James and the falsified documents folded neatly inside a satchel. Sheriff Jackson looked up from his desk, irritation already creasing his brow. "Mrs. Cornell," he greeted stiffly. "Always a pleasure, though I can't imagine what brings you to my humble corner." Elizabeth smiled with the kind of politeness that kills. "I've come to report a crime, Sheriff. A rather vile one, involving fraud and abuse of a woman under false pretenses." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "This wouldn't have anything to do with Mr. Walsh, would it?" "It does," James said smoothly. "We have evidence that he forged legal documents, marriage papers, to deceive a servant in his household. There are witnesses, physical copies, and—" Jackson raised a hand, cutting him off. "You're wasting your time. The girl's colored, ain't she?" Elizabeth's eyes hardened. "Her name is Nancy Walsh. She was promised manumission through a legally executed contract. There is no legal marriage between a slave and a white man in this state," the sheriff said flatly, "which means there's no fraud, no breach, and no crime. You're saying a man can forge the court's seal, lie under oath, and imprison a woman, and that isn't a crime?" Elizabeth asked. "I'm saying the law don't recognize her to begin with," Jackson replied. "How do you defraud property? You can't. The case is closed before it begins." James clenched his jaw, ready to protest, but Elizabeth stopped him with a look. She understood that pressing further would only amuse the man. She rose from her chair slowly. "Then I thank you, Sheriff, for confirming what I already suspected, that this county's justice is worth less than its dirt." Jackson chuckled. "Careful, Mrs. Cornell. Your husband's reputation don't make you untouchable." Elizabeth leaned in, her voice a whisper of steel. "No, but it makes me loud." She turned and left without another word. Back at the Cornell estate, Elizabeth was silent during supper. James watched her carefully. "We expected resistance," he said. "You knew the sheriff wouldn't risk angering Walsh's allies." Elizabeth's spoon clattered against the plate. "I didn't expect justice from him. I expected a door to open. Now we know where it is and who's guarding it." She looked to Nancy, who sat quietly in the corner of the dining hall, feeding Hope small spoonfuls of milk. "The law won't save us," Elizabeth said, "but it can still be turned against him. We just need one thing he doesn't have." "What's that?" Nancy asked softly. "A white man willing to tell the truth." Nancy frowned, confused, until Elizabeth continued. "The priest, the one who called himself Father Murphy. You said he looked nervous, didn't you? That his collar seemed borrowed." "Yes, madam," Nancy said. "He smelled of whiskey. His hands shook." "Then he wasn't a priest," Elizabeth said. "He was a man for hire. And men for hire have debts, weaknesses, needs. We will find him." Over the next several weeks, the search began quietly. James used his connections through merchants and parish registries, claiming to be tracing a debt owed to a clergyman named Murphy. None of the churches had record of him. A few locals recalled a man matching the description, middle-aged, unshaven, Irish accent, partial to cards, but no one knew his real name. Elizabeth grew restless, her composure thinning at the edges. She began to visit Nancy more often, not as an interrogator but as something closer to an ally. They would talk long after sunset, Elizabeth pacing, Nancy rocking Hope to sleep. "You think he'll ever pay for what he's done?" Nancy asked one evening. Elizabeth paused by the window, her reflection haloed by lamplight. "Men like Trent only pay when someone else writes the bill. Then who will write it?" Elizabeth turned, her expression unreadable. "We will." For Nancy, it was the first time anyone had ever said we and meant it. Vase. A month passed. News from town was quiet, but Elizabeth had grown too accustomed to waiting. "We need movement," she told James. "Find new eyes. I want every tavern, every church basement, every gambling hall checked." It was in one of those taverns, the Copper Bell, that James finally heard the rumor that changed everything. A drunk mentioned a man called Thomas McKenna, once a clerk's assistant, now a drifter who played preacher for rich fools. The description fit perfectly. James returned home that night with the spark of triumph in his voice. "He's in town, Liz, living near the old mill, in a shack not fit for a stray dog." Elizabeth's eyes gleamed. "Then let's pay a visit." But before she could act, she turned to Nancy. "When we find him, you must be ready to face him. He'll remember you. That's our proof." Nancy's breath caught. "You mean I must see him again?" "Yes," Elizabeth said softly. "Because justice, my dear, is never won from a distance." That night, as thunder rumbled again in the hills, Nancy sat awake beside her daughter's crib. For the first time since her imprisonment, she felt the pulse of something stronger than fear, not hope. Not yet. It was hunger, the hunger to be seen, to be heard, to make her name more than the sound of someone else's ownership. And now, somewhere out there in the dark, was a man who had sold his soul for Trent silver and who didn't yet know that his confession would become the blade that finally cut the Walsh name to pieces. The day they found him, the air hung low and heavy, like the sky itself was listening. James Cornell had followed the trail for nearly a week, from tavern to churchyard to a decaying boarding house behind the river mill. Each clue led him closer until he finally saw the man Elizabeth had described, unkempt, half-drunk, and muttering to himself about sins that don't wash clean. Thomas McKenna, the false priest, the man who had read vows from a stolen Bible and turned a woman's hope into a cage. When James told Elizabeth, she said only, "Prepare the carriage. We go tonight." Nancy stood by the window as dusk gathered, her heart hammering. "You want me to go too?" Elizabeth's eyes were steady. "He'll deny it unless you stand before him. Memory is a weapon. You must make him see what he did." Nancy hesitated. "If he's like the others, he'll pretend not to know me." Elizabeth reached out, laying a hand gently on her shoulder. "Then make him remember. Not with anger, just truth. Men like him can survive violence. They can't survive guilt." The house where McKenna lived looked less like a home and more like an apology that had been left to rot. Its roof sagged inward, the shutters hung loose, and the air stank of mold, tobacco, and failure. When Elizabeth, James, and Nancy approached, a dog barked once and fled. McKenna opened the door after James knocked twice. He was thin, grey, his eyes watery and bloodshot. The collar he wore was frayed, a poor attempt at respectability. When he saw Elizabeth's fine dress and James's polished cane, his shoulders stiffened. "Evening, ma'am, sir," he said nervously. "If you've come for donations, I've none to give." Elizabeth's tone was cool, polite, and utterly deadly. "We've come for confession, Mr. McKenna." He blinked. I don't follow." "Of course you do," she said. "You married a woman named Nancy Walsh to a man named Norman. You were paid handsomely by Trent Walsh to make it look legal." McKenna froze, every color draining from his face. I've done many ceremonies. I don't recall that name." Nancy stepped forward from the shadows, hope wrapped in a shawl across her chest. Her voice trembled, but her words cut through the silence like a blade. "You called yourself Father Murphy. You told me God was watching. You said I'd be free." McKenna's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "I don't." Elizabeth stepped closer. "Shall I refresh your memory? You signed your name as witness. You stamped a false seal. And you took $50 from Mr. Walsh for your trouble." His hands shook. "I had debts," he whispered. "It wasn't supposed to hurt nobody." "But it did," Elizabeth said quietly. "You turned a woman's faith into a weapon against her. You helped a man commit fraud under God's name." McKenna backed up until his legs hit a chair, and he sat heavily. "You don't understand. Walsh promised it was just for show. Said he'd free her after the baby." Nancy's breath caught. "He said the same to me." McKenna buried his face in his hands. "I shouldn't have done it, but I needed the money. I was drinking bad in those days. The banks wanted their dues." He said no harm would come of it. "I swear it." James folded his arms. "And when harm did come?" McKenna looked up, tears streaking through the grime on his cheeks. I heard he kept her locked up, but I didn't know it'd go that far." Elizabeth leaned down, her voice low and sharp. "You'll tell that to a judge. Every detail, every coin he paid you, every word you spoke that night." He blinked rapidly. "If I do, he'll ruin me. He's got friends in this county, men who could." "Ruin you?" Elizabeth interrupted. "Look around, Mr. McKenna. You're already ruined. The only thing you have left to lose is your chance at redemption." James added, quietly but firmly, "We can protect you, pay your debts, clear your name, but only if you testify." McKenna stared at them for a long moment. His eyes drifted to Nancy standing still, the baby's soft breath against her neck. For the first time, shame seemed to land fully on him. "I'll tell the truth," he said finally, voice breaking. "I'll tell it all." Elizabeth straightened. "Good. You'll write a statement tonight. Then, you'll swear to it before the magistrate tomorrow. If you try to run, the sheriff will have your name and your debt records before sunrise." McKenna nodded weakly. "I understand." As he began to write, the only sounds were the scratch of pen against paper and Hope's faint sighs. Nancy stood by the door, her hands trembling. She had waited so long to hear someone speak the truth aloud, and now that it was happening, it didn't feel like victory, it felt like exorcism. When the confession was finished, Elizabeth folded it neatly and tucked it into her coat. "You've just undone a monster," she said. "Try not to become one again." They left him there in the flickering lamplight, a man surrounded by his sin. Isidore. The next morning, Elizabeth delivered the signed confession to Sheriff Jackson's office. He tried to scoff, but his voice faltered when he read the document. "You're saying a white man admits to forgery, perjury, and conspiracy," he said. "I'm not saying it," Elizabeth replied coolly. "He is." Jackson rubbed his temple. "That's enough to force a hearing, but if this turns out false..." "It won't," she said. By dusk, the warrant was signed. Trent Walsh was arrested the following morning as he stepped out onto his veranda. His pride was still wrapped around him like armor, but even armor cracks when it hears its own name on a warrant. He cursed, shouted, called it slander and conspiracy, but the sheriff's deputies held fast. The papers bore the seal of the court, and McKenna's signature left no room for protest. The plantation workers watched from a distance as Trent was led away in irons. For years, his voice had been the thunder that ruled their days. Now, that thunder was gone. Nancy stood behind the gate, hope in her arms, her breath shallow, her heart uncertain. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt only the weight of it all, the years stolen, the child born of deceit, the scars that even justice couldn't erase. Elizabeth approached quietly. "It's done," she said. "He'll face trial next month." Nancy looked up. "Will they believe me?" Elizabeth smiled faintly. "They don't have to. They'll believe him." "McKenna?" Elizabeth nodded. "A white man's confession opens every door. A black woman's truth could not." She turned toward the horizon where the sky was beginning to pale. "For the first time, the law will look him in the eye, and if it won't see your pain, it will at least see his guilt." Nancy watched the sheriff's wagon vanish down the road. The sun was rising behind the trees, casting long shadows across the wet ground. Hope stirred in her arms and began to cry softly, her voice small but insistent. Nancy kissed her forehead and whispered, "He can't hurt us now." Elizabeth glanced at her, eyes thoughtful. "No," she said, "but men like him leave stains that don't wash away easily. We'll need to scrub hard before we're clean." Nancy nodded. "Then let's begin." Red. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth prepared for trial with the same ruthless discipline she once used to run her estate. McKenna was kept under watch at a small cabin near the courthouse, guarded by one of the Cornell overseers. Each night, Elizabeth visited him, drilling his testimony until every detail matched Nancy's account. Nancy herself rehearsed for days, learning how to tell her story without breaking. Elizabeth corrected her posture, her phrasing, even her pauses. "You're not pleading for sympathy," she said. "You're stating a fact that cannot be denied. Let the truth speak louder than your pain." By the time the court date was set, word had spread through the county like wildfire. The idea that a man of Trent Walsh's standing would be tried for fraud against a slave electrified the gossip mills. Some called it scandal, others justice. Most called it impossible. But impossible things had already happened, and as the courthouse bell tolled over the sleepy Alabama town, Nancy felt the old world beginning, however faintly, to tremble. The morning of the trial began like any other in Sumter County, mist rising off the fields, the courthouse square buzzing with gossip disguised as concern. But that day, the whispers carried a different weight. It wasn't about crops or church or weather. It was about a white man on trial because of a black woman's truth. Such a thing wasn't supposed to happen, and yet, here they were. Elizabeth and James Cornell arrived early, their carriage polished to a mirror shine. Appearances mattered. They represented wealth, credibility, and the illusion of order. Everything about them said respectable authority, the kind that forced men like Sheriff Jackson to stand straighter when they entered the room. Nancy followed in a separate wagon, holding Hope close beneath a shawl. Her heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She wasn't seated among the white observers, but in a corner near the witnesses' bench, separated by a low rail. Even here, her place in the world was marked. The courtroom smelled of sweat and varnish. Sunlight sliced through the tall windows, lighting the dust that hung in the air like judgment itself. Trent Walsh sat at the defendant's table, his wrists shackled, his expression composed but brittle. His grey hair was neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved, but his eyes, those sharp, predatory eyes, still carried the glint of a man who believed himself above consequence. When he saw Nancy enter, a faint smirk tugged at his mouth. She looked away. Judge Whitmore presided, a man whose jowls drooped like wet parchment. He adjusted his spectacles and began the proceedings with the slow drawl of someone unused to controversy. This court will hear the case of the state of Alabama versus Mr. Trent Walsh, charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit unlawful acts against the public trust. The prosecutor, a young attorney from Mobile named Harland Pierce, stepped forward. He was nervous but firm, aware that this case would either make his career or end it. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today because a man of standing used the instruments of law not to preserve it, but to pervert it. He forged official documents, deceived a clergyman, and manipulated the trust of a woman in his household, all to create the illusion of righteousness while committing the vilest deceit." The defense attorney, an older man named Mr. Dade, rose slowly. "My client is accused of crimes impossible under the law. The supposed victim," he said, gesturing toward Nancy without looking at her, "is a person of color, an enslaved woman who cannot, by statute, enter into any legal contract, much less a marriage with a white man. Therefore, no fraud can exist where no law recognizes the act." A murmur rippled through the room. Elizabeth's eyes flashed with quiet fury. The judge banged his gavel. "Order." The prosecutor called his first witness, Thomas McKenna. McKenna shuffled to the stand, visibly shaking. His hair was unkempt, his collar gone, and the faint smell of whiskey clung to him despite Elizabeth's strict instructions. But his eyes, haunted, ashamed, were sober. "State your name and occupation," Pierce instructed. "Thomas McKenna," he said hoarsely, "former clerk, part-time preacher." Pierce nodded. "Mr. McKenna, did you perform a marriage ceremony between Norman Walsh and a woman named Nancy in May of 1847? McKenna swallowed hard. "I did." "And were you a licensed priest or minister at that time?" He hesitated. "No, sir." Gasps filled the courtroom. Pierce stepped closer. "Did Mr. Trent Walsh pay you to perform that ceremony?" "Yes." "How much?" $50, and he promised more once it was done. "And what did he ask of you?" McKenna's voice cracked. "He said he needed the girl to believe it was legal, said it'd make her cooperate and keep quiet. He gave me the papers to sign already sealed. I just read from the book and made it look proper." "Did you know those documents were forged?" "I did. I helped make him look real." Pierce held up the papers, yellowed and creased from Nancy's years of hiding them. "Are these the same documents?" McKenna nodded miserably. "Aye, my handwriting's there." The prosecutor turned to the jury, his tone cutting through the murmurs. "A man of God or pretending to be used to give legitimacy to a crime, the signature of a sinner bought by a liar." Defense attorney Dade stood. "Mr. McKenna, you admit you were paid. You admit you're guilty of fraud yourself. Why should we believe a confessed criminal?" McKenna's shoulders sagged. "Because what I done can't be undone, but telling the truth might keep it from happening again." Even the judge shifted uncomfortably. Pierce called his next witness, Nancy. The room stilled as she approached the stand. Elizabeth's eyes followed her with quiet pride. Nancy placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath, her voice low but unwavering. "Tell the court," said Pierce gently, "how you came to be involved in these events." Nancy began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She told them everything: the promise of freedom, the ceremony, Norman's sickness, his death, and Trent's betrayal. She described the confinement, the sheriff's cruelty, the months in the barn, and the night she named her child Hope, because hope was all she had left. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even those who had come to mock her sat still, their faces pale. Defense attorney Dade rose again. "You expect this court to believe that a woman of your standing, a slave, was capable of reading legal documents, understanding contracts, and remembering word for word what was said 8 years ago?" Nancy's eyes lifted to meet his. "I was capable enough to be used," she said quietly. "Capable enough for him to trust me with his secrets, to bear his son's child, and to be lied to in his name. Don't tell me what I was capable of, sir. I lived it." A few people gasped. Others averted their eyes. Dade sputtered. "You're emotional. You." "I'm alive," Nancy said. "That's more than some can say after his mercy." The judge banged his gavel again, but the room had already shifted. For the first time, people were listening. Elizabeth was called next. She testified with calculated grace, presenting herself as a concerned neighbor and citizen. She detailed her discovery of the fraud, the rivalry that had forced her to act, and the moral obligation that had guided her. She omitted her personal hatred, but let her tone sharpen whenever she said Trent's name. When the prosecutor rested his case, the defense had little left to stand on. Their witnesses, 2 overseers and a banker, spoke vaguely of Trent's honor and good standing, but even their voices faltered under the weight of the evidence. In closing, Pierce addressed the jury. "The defense will tell you that law belongs only to some men. That truth depends on color, and justice depends on who can pay for it. But the law, when stripped of its fear, belongs to no man. And today, gentlemen, it demands one thing only: accountability." The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice was tight. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." A murmur surged through the room like wind through dry grass. Trent's face went white. He turned toward Nancy, eyes blazing not with remorse, but with disbelief. "You think this changes anything?" He spat. "You'll still be nothing." Elizabeth stepped forward before the bailiff could. Her voice was cold as marble. "Then I'll be nothing standing over your grave." The judge banged the gavel for silence. "Trent Walsh is hereby sentenced to 6 years in state prison for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud the court. May this verdict remind all that deceit carries its price." The shackles clinked as the deputies led him away. For the first time, Trent's confidence cracked. The mask fell, and underneath was the face of a man stripped bare, not powerful, not feared, just small. Nancy sat motionless, her hands trembling around the shawl that held hope. The noise of the courtroom faded to a hum. She could barely breathe. Elizabeth turned to her, eyes gleaming not with triumph, but with something deeper. "It's over," she whispered. Nancy shook her head. "No, madam, it's only begun." Outside the courthouse, the wind shifted. The world hadn't changed overnight, but it had tilted, even slightly. A woman who was never meant to speak had been heard, and a man who was never meant to fall had been judged. And in that fragile space between ruin and redemption, the South took one uneasy breath toward something new. The trial ended, but the echoes of it lingered in every corner of Sumter County. Gossip traveled faster than wagons. Some said Trent Walsh had gone mad in his cell, others that he'd bribed the guards and would return to claim his land. For Nancy, those whispers were only ghosts of a nightmare that refused to die. Weeks after the sentencing, she still woke at night to phantom footsteps outside her cabin. Every creak of the wind through the shutters felt like the sound of a key turning in a lock. Yet when she looked down at her sleeping daughter, she reminded herself, "He's behind bars. He can't hurt us anymore." Still, freedom did not feel the way she had once imagined. It wasn't wide skies or open roads. It was silence, the kind that tests you, the kind that asks, "Now, what will you do with the heir you fought for?" Elizabeth visited often, sometimes with news of the outside world, sometimes with nothing more than tea and a long, assessing look. Nancy had learned that those visits always meant something. Elizabeth never wasted time on pleasantries. One afternoon, she appeared at Nancy's door carrying a small wooden box. "May I come in?" Nancy nodded, setting Hope down in her cradle. "Of course, madam." Elizabeth sat at the small table and opened the box. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with ribbon. "These are yours," she said simply. Nancy hesitated before touching them. "What is this?" "Your manumission papers," Elizabeth said. "Signed, witnessed, and registered with the county clerk this morning. You are, in every legal sense, a free woman. Nancy's hands shook as she unfolded the top sheet. Her name, Nancy Walsh, was written in neat, official script. Not property, not servant, just Nancy. Tears blurred the ink. I don't know what to say. Elizabeth poured herself tea, her expression unreadable. Don't thank me. I didn't do it for gratitude. Nancy smiled faintly through the tears. You never do. Elizabeth looked at her then, eyes softer than Nancy had ever seen. Sit. There's something else you need to hear. Nancy sat slowly. Elizabeth took a deep breath. I told you once that Trent had wronged me too. It's time you know what that means. Her voice dropped low, each word careful, deliberate. When I was 18, my father sent me to a harvest ball at the Walsh plantation. Trent was already a man then, charming, admired, powerful. He found me alone in the garden and, her voice faltered for the first time Nancy could remember. She stared at her tea as if it could swallow the memory. He took what he wanted, and I learned what kind of man he truly was. The words hung in the air like smoke. Nancy sat frozen, her own breath shallow. Elizabeth continued, her voice cold now, steady again. I told no one, not my father, not my husband. In this world, silence was safer than shame. But when I learned what he did to you, when I heard how he'd used the same kind of deceit, the same hunger for control, I decided silence was no longer an option. Nancy swallowed hard. So this, all of this, the trial, the plan, it was revenge. Elizabeth met her gaze. At first, yes, but it became something more. I saw in you what I'd once buried in myself, a woman stripped of power but still standing. I wanted to destroy him, but I also wanted you to survive him. The room went quiet except for the ticking of the small clock on the shelf. Hope stirred in her cradle, murmuring softly in her sleep. Nancy looked down at her daughter, then back at Elizabeth. You gave me freedom, but what will we do with it now? A free colored woman and a child like mine, there's no place in this county for us. Elizabeth nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that. She reached again into the box and drew out a single folded document sealed in wax. I've arranged for your daughter to be registered as an orphaned godchild under the Cornell name. She'll have education, safety, and a future that no one can take. She will grow up free, not as a servant, but as a young lady of means. Nancy stared at her. But if she's your godchild, Elizabeth's voice softened. Then publicly, she cannot be your daughter. The words struck like a physical blow. Nancy's throat tightened. You mean I'd have to give her up? You'd remain here as her nurse and tutor. You would raise her, teach her, love her, but to the world, you'd only be the devoted caretaker. It's the only way to keep her safe. Nancy rose, pacing the small room. You're asking me to lie about my own blood. I'm asking you to protect her, Elizabeth said firmly. If the world knows she's your child, she'll carry your scars before she can even speak. Let her live unmarked. Nancy turned away, tears streaming freely now. How can a mother not claim her child? Elizabeth stood and walked to her, her own eyes glistening. By understanding that love isn't always about claiming, it's about preserving. I can't undo what he did to either of us, but I can make sure his legacy dies with him. The silence that followed was unbearable. The rain began outside, light at first, then harder. Hope stirred again, letting out a soft cry. Nancy bent over the cradle, lifting her daughter and pressing her close. She'll grow up never knowing she's mine, she whispered, not until she's ready. Elizabeth placed a hand on her shoulder, and when she is, she'll learn the truth from the only person who deserves to tell it. Nancy turned to face her, trembling. Promise me that day will come. Elizabeth nodded. I swear it. They stood together for a long time, the rain drumming on the roof, two women bound by pain, by defiance, and by an unspoken understanding that history would not remember them kindly, but it would remember them. When Elizabeth finally left, Nancy sat beside the cradle until dawn. She watched Hope sleep, tracing the child's tiny fingers with her own. In the first pale light of morning, she whispered, You will never know chains, you'll never beg a man for your worth, and one day, when the world is ready, you'll know who you are and what I gave to make it so. The baby stirred, then smiled faintly in her sleep. Nancy looked out the window as the clouds began to part. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sun was rising over a world that had not yet learned mercy, but she was still here. and for the first time, that was enough. Years passed quietly after the trial, quietly enough that people began to forget. That was how the South liked its memories, muffled, rewritten, folded neatly into the kind of silence that kept its own conscience clean. But the land never forgets, and neither did the women who had lived under its shadow. Trent Walsh died in his cell 4 years after his conviction. The papers called it natural causes, though rumor said he wasted away in solitude, muttering about forged papers and ghosts that whispered in the dark. His body was returned to Sumter County with no procession, no ceremony, just a pine box and a name that no longer commanded respect. His plantation was sold off to pay debts. Within a year, the Walsh estate was gone, its fields parceled out to creditors and neighboring farms. Nancy didn't attend the burial. She only knew about it because a messenger brought word to the Cornell estate. When she heard, she didn't weep or rejoice. She simply closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, not for his soul, but for the end of his reach. "The world is lighter now," she said softly, and went back to her work. By then, life on the Cornell property had settled into a delicate balance. Nancy was, officially, a free woman and the head servant of the household. Unofficially, she was something much more complicated, the quiet heart of a secret that grew taller every year. Hope, bright, curious, fiercely intelligent, was now a girl of 6. Everyone in town knew her as Miss Hope Cornell, the godchild of Elizabeth and James. They adored her, and so did the neighbors. Few questioned the child's mixed complexion. Those who did were met with Elizabeth's unflinching gaze and the unspoken warning that certain questions were too costly to ask. To the world, Nancy was her nanny, a devoted caretaker whose loyalty bordered on legend. But to Hope, she was something deeper, something instinctive. The child ran to her first when frightened, reached for her hand in church, fell asleep each night to the rhythm of Nancy's lullabies. Sometimes, when Hope pressed her small face against Nancy's cheek, the woman would close her eyes and imagine whispering the truth. "You are mine." But she never did. Not yet. Elizabeth kept her promise. She treated Hope as her own, ensuring she had tutors, books, and piano lessons. But she also kept Nancy close, and their late-night conversations continued long after the rest of the house had gone to bed. They rarely spoke of Trent anymore. Instead, they spoke of what came next, how to use their positions to protect others, how to bend the edges of a cruel system without being broken by it. Nancy learned to read the world as Elizabeth did, with calculation. She taught younger servants to hide their savings, to keep records, to write letters that could one day prove ownership or freedom. Quiet rebellion disguised as education. She also began to write her own story, small pieces at first, scribbled in notebooks Elizabeth gave her. Not diaries of emotion, but accounts, names, dates, details of what had been done and what had been endured. "So no one can ever say it didn't happen," she told Elizabeth one night. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "History forgets women like us unless we carve our names into its bones." Nancy's reply was soft but certain. "Then we'll carve." Red. When Hope turned 16, she was sent to school in the North, a decision that both terrified and relieved Nancy. The girl was too bright, too fearless to be confined to Alabama, and in Massachusetts, no one would question her name or her skin. The day she left, Nancy stood at the edge of the train platform, watching her daughter lean from the window, waving until the smoke swallowed her. Elizabeth stood beside her, composed as ever. "She'll be safe there," Elizabeth said. "I know," Nancy whispered, "but safe don't mean near." Years passed again. Hope grew into a woman the world admired, eloquent, educated, and unafraid to challenge injustice in polite company. Letters arrived every month, carefully worded, always addressed to Aunt Nancy, never Mother. Yet in every line was love, and Nancy could read between the ink what society would not allow to be written. She kept each letter wrapped in silk inside the same wooden box that once held her freedom papers. Elizabeth aged too, though her mind stayed sharp until the end. When she fell ill one winter evening, Nancy sat beside her bed, holding her hand. Elizabeth's voice was faint but still laced with that familiar command. "Tell her," she whispered. "When she's ready, tell her everything. Let the truth belong to her." "I will," Nancy promised. Elizabeth smiled once more, half victory, half peace, and closed her eyes for the last time. Lever J. The spring that followed felt emptier, But Nancy stayed on at the estate. It was no longer duty that kept her, it was promise. And then, one morning, hope returned. Grown now, graceful and self-assured, she carried herself with the same quiet strength that had once defined both her mothers. She found Nancy in the garden, kneeling among the wildflowers Elizabeth had loved. "Aunt Nancy," she said softly. Nancy looked up, blinking in the sunlight. "Miss Hope." They stood like that for a moment, the years between them, heavy but familiar. Then Hope stepped forward, knelt, and took Nancy's hands in hers. "I know," she said simply. Nancy's breath caught. "Who told you?" "No one," Hope replied. "But I've always known, in the way you looked at me, in the way you said my name." She smiled gently. "You don't have to hide anymore." For the first time in decades, Nancy allowed herself to weep without restraint. She pressed her forehead to her daughter's and whispered, "You were the only thing he ever gave me that wasn't pain." Hope held her tighter. "And the only thing he ever gave you that survived him?" "Zero." Nancy lived another 10 years after that reunion. When she passed, Hope buried her beside Elizabeth in the Cornell family cemetery. The stone bore no title, no mention of bondage or shame, just 3 words carved deep enough to outlast the weather. Nancy Walsh, woman of extraordinary courage. Hope never forgot her promise. She published Nancy's writings edited carefully under the title Letters from the Forgotten. The book, circulated quietly in northern presses, became one of the earliest first-hand accounts of deceit and survival in the antebellum South. It told not just of cruelty, but of endurance, of how 2 women, one born free, one born enslaved, used the tools of their oppressors to carve out justice of their own making. And in the final page, Hope wrote a single line beneath her mother's closing words. "Freedom is not a gift granted by the powerful, it is a truth reclaimed by the broken." When readers reached that line, most didn't know the full story. They didn't know about the forged marriage, the barn, the trial, or the years of silence that followed. But they felt it. And somewhere, beneath Alabama's heavy soil, the woman who once believed freedom was just ink on a page finally had her story written in stone.